En primer lugar tenemos a Jan Caruter, el actual presidente del Consejo de Normas Internacionales de Contabilidad del Sector Público, IPSAS Board por sus siglas en inglés, que asumió este cargo a partir del mes de enero del año 2016. Sin embargo, Jan ya ha sido el miembro del Consejo desde el año 2010, incluso encabezó trabajos de IPSAS Board sobre la sostenibilidad financiera a largo plazo y enajenación entre las IPSAS y las estadísticas de las finanzas públicas. Después de unirse al Departamento de Tesoro de PricewaterhouseCoopers en 1999, Jan desempeñó su papel clave en transición del gobierno británico de la base contable de efectivo a la elaboración de un presupuesto devengado y a la presentación de informes con base en devengado. Se incorporó al CIPFA, al Instituto de Finanzas Públicas con base en Inglaterra a partir del año 2016, en la cual estaba promoviendo y apoyando las mejores prácticas en la gestión financiera pública y gobernanza de los servicios públicos a nivel mundial, así como el establecimiento de normas para la gestión financiera y la elaboración de informes para el gobierno local del Reino Unido. A continuación vamos a tener a Amy Edwards. Amy es asesora senior de transparencia financiera en la oficina del secretario fiscal adjunto del Departamento del Tesoro de Estados Unidos. Amy está apoyando la implementación de la Ley de Responsabilidad y Transparencia Digital, Ley de Datos y otras reformas de la gestión financiera en el Departamento de Tesoro. Y previamente desempeñó cargo como directora de la Fuerza de Tarea de Desempeño del Gobierno en el Comité de Presupuesto del Senado en Estados Unidos, apoyando principalmente al senador Mark Warner, demócrata del estado de Virginia. Proporcionó también apoyo de personal para la aprobación de la Ley de Modernización de Desempeño y Resultados del Gobierno de 2010 y de la Ley de Datos. Anteriormente, Amy fue gerente de proyectos de desempeño del gobierno en el Centro Pew de los Estados Unidos, en donde ella gestionó el desarrollo del informe de administración de 50 estados. Edwards también desempeñó como director senior de liderazgo y desempeño en el Consejo de Excelencia en el Gobierno. Más adelante vamos a contar con la participación de la doctora Sama Masrani. Sama es la economista del Departamento de Asuntos Fiscales del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Se unió al Fondo Monetario en el año 2011 después de obtener su título de doctora en Economía por la Universidad de Pittsburgh. Desde entonces ha trabajado en diversos países, principalmente del Grupo 20, G20, tanto emergentes como en vía de desarrollo, en las áreas de supervisión bilateral, de programas del fondo y en la asistencia técnica. Su especialidad es investigación, que se centra en política fiscal, la aplicación de modelos empíricos macroeconómicos, la estimación de multiplicadores fiscales, la evaluación de estrés fiscal y los riesgos fiscales. Recientemente ha investigado también a profundidad diversas cuestiones de política de gastos, incluyendo la inversión pública y las asociaciones públicas privadas. Más adelante vamos a tener a María Teresa Castro. María Teresa es egresada de la carrera de Actuaría de la Facultad de Ciencias de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, UNAM. Cuenta con 19 años de experiencia y servicio en la Administración Pública Federal. Actualmente desempeña como titular de la Unidad Contabilidad Gubernamental en la Secretaría de la Hacienda y Crédito Público y también funge como secretaria técnica del Consejo Nacional de Armonización Contable, CONAC. Anteriormente ha sido directora general de Política Presupuestaria en la Unidad de Política y Control Presupuestario en la Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público. También ha sido directora general de Programación y Presupuesto en la Oficialía Mayor de la Secretaría de Trabajo y Previsión Social, directora de Control e Integración Presupuestaria en la Unidad de Política y Control Presupuestario. Y finalmente, el panel lo va a clausurar Yolanda Bascuñán, la subjefa de División de Análisis Contable de la Contraloría General de la República de Chile. Yolanda es contadora pública y auditora de profesión, titulada de la Universidad de Santiago de Chile. Ingresó en la Contraloría General de la República desde el año 1986. y en paralelo también ha desarrollado labores docentes en la Universidad de Santiago de Chile y en Contraloría. Anteriormente ha desempeñado como jefe de área de normas y estadísticas en el mismo organismo Contraloría General de la República, formando parte del equipo que lidera el proceso de convergencia con las normas internacionales de contabilidad del sector público. Sin más preámbulos, le paso la palabra a Jan. Guardamos los aplausos al final. Muchas gracias.
So thank you very much, Dimitri, for that introduction. What I'm going to do is just very briefly give you an introduction to the IPSAS board, and then I'll start to talk about some of the guidance that we have in terms of best practice in implementation. And many of you will already know this, but it was suggested it would be a good idea just to make sure that everybody was aware of the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. We're an independent standards board working under the auspices of the International Federation of Accountants. We're one of 4 standards boards. The others are the Audit and Assurance Standards Board, the Ethics Standards Board, and my colleague Stavros Tomodakis, who's the chairman of the Ethics Standards Board, is sitting in the front row here, and also the Education Standards Board. The IPSASB has a secretariat of 8. The technical director, John Stanford, is sitting down at the front here, and he'll be here the rest of the week. And we have 18 board members, of which I'm one. Araceli Mendez, who's sitting in the back row, is one of our board members who we're very pleased to have, and a very strong connection to Latin America. One of the things that we've done in terms of developing the board over the last few years is to strengthen the governance around our activities. So we now have the Public Interest Committee overseeing our activities, which comprises a number of international organisations, in particular the World Bank, and Ed Olowoy-Okere is sitting down in the front row. So Ed, thank you very much for your input to our activities. Also the IMF, OECD and Intersci are the other members of that Public Interest Committee. Now, where are we at the moment? Well, to date, we've set 35 accrual-based standards, and I think it's important just to note, because it sometimes causes confusion, we do have one cash-based standard, but we're in the process of revising that to make sure that it's clear that that is not an end in itself. We see that as a stepping stone on the way to the introduction of full accrual for government. So what we do with those 35 standards is to provide guidance from a public sector perspective on recognition and measurement. And certainly there are a lot of issues around recognition and measurement which are actually quite tricky when you move as a government from cash to accrual. And certainly I'm sure we'll hear about some of those challenges from my colleagues. In terms of our work-setting standards, one of the crucial changes that we made in 2015 when we consulted on our strategy and work plan that we're working on at the moment was clearly to link our work to strengthening public financial management. And I think that is certainly one of the very important objectives for the board. It's also where a lot of the challenges lie, I think, in terms of making best use of the accrual-based information for public financial management purposes. Now, just briefly, the work plan that we have at the moment, what we're trying to do is very much balance making sure that we focus on public sector issues, but also where it's appropriate, and this is important, where governments are consolidating state-owned enterprises, that we keep up with the latest developments in international financial reporting standards. So when you look at our current work programme, you'll see a strong balance in favour of public sector-specific issues, but also making sure that we keep up with the latest developments in IFRS, particularly accounting for leases, for revenue and for financial instruments. So that's very much where the board is at the moment, and a bit about the background. So if I just then turn to some of the other material that we've produced over the years, and one of the most important pieces and very important in terms of this panel, is a slightly cryptically titled publication, Study 14, but it actually, I think, is incredibly useful guidance for those governments who are actually planning a move to accrual, because what it does is actually to give you a very good overview of the sorts of challenges that you'll face and some of the ideas and the things to focus on in terms of planning the implementation of accrual for government. And what I'm going to talk about particularly today focuses on what's in part one of that document. There are also plenty of links to guidance and experience and so on. So I've given you the web reference for the document. And if you're actually in the early stages of planning and implementation, or even actually in the middle of planning and implementation, and you haven't actually looked at this document, I would encourage you to go to the website and have a look at it. And part one is particularly useful in terms of Study 14 because it focuses on key success features, and in particular it picks out 4, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. Firstly, being clear about the scope and the mandate for the transition to accrual. Making sure that there is appropriate and strong commitment, and that's not just amongst the profession, but it's amongst other officials and particularly politicians, which can be extremely important in terms of successful accrual implementation, focusing on the various different types of resources and the trade-offs for those, and also then what is important in terms of strong program management, and you know, as Dimitri mentioned, personally having led a government consolidation of the entire public sector in the United Kingdom, I can very much relate to the practical aspects of implementation and how important those are. So if we just turn first to having a clear scope and mandate, and I suppose in a sense that sounds as though it would be very straightforward, but in reality actually it can be quite complex, because is this just changing to accrual reporting and it's just purely a financial reporting issue, or are you actually planning to go further in terms of should the country actually base its budgets on accrual? Are you going to use the information not only for individual reporting entities, but for the government as a whole in terms of fiscal statistics and links into government finance statistics in order to deliver that? So that's a very important decision to take, needs to be taken up front, because it very much will influence the design of the reforms, the way in which you approach it. Sorry, I'm going back. Thinking about those sorts of things will then determine, well, what's the extent of the reform? Is it just government departments? Are you talking about the statutory entities also within central government? Are you looking at state governments, local governments, and so on? Also, what's the position of state-owned enterprises? So, you know, how do you approach the reform? Also, are you going to consolidate those just at the federal level, or are you going to try and consolidate more broadly? That will influence the design of the reform, and also very much needs to be decided up front in terms of making sure that you've got the right sponsorship, and I'll talk about that. And then clearly the legal situation within the jurisdiction will have a strong influence on the design of the reforms. It's perhaps easier if you have a much more sort of unitary constitution and government structures, perhaps in, say, in Peru or maybe Colombia. But if you've got a federal arrangement, for example, in Brazil or Argentina, then the way in which you need to approach the reform and the sponsorship for it will change. And probably crucially, for any of those reforms, actually making sure that you have the appropriate legislative framework in place to underpin the reforms, because certainly from my personal experience, people won't necessarily want to undertake the reform, and actually if you have the legislation there in the background to be able to, you know, if somebody says to you, well, why do I have to do it? The law says you have to, and that's a very powerful driver. Okay, so let's think a little bit about the commitment. And certainly, you know, I know from my own experience that really having strong top-level commitment, both from politicians and also from senior ministry officials in the Ministry of Finance, but also in other government ministries, is really, really important. Thinking about successful reforms, you'll need to think about, well, are you likely to have elections during the period of the reform? Might you actually get a change in government? Because that doesn't just mean that you're looking at the current governing party, but also do you need to actually talk to the opposition within government and make sure that actually you've got their support, so that if there is a change in government, you're not going to get a sort of immediate change in, well, we want the reform to focus differently, or maybe we're not committed to the reform at all. Certainly, if you're planning to make a change in terms of how the legislature actually votes, you know, resources, allocates resources, that will impact on the degree of support and how you approach this. And sometimes this means changes within the Ministry of Finance. So who will the key supporters be? Where will your sources of support be if things actually don't go according to plan, and there will be things that don't work out well enough? So who will help fix things when they go wrong? So I do think legislation underpinning all of that is going to be really important, and it will actually be a demonstration of the level of support that you have if you need to make those changes up front. So I'll move on then and talk a little bit about the resources. Inevitably, the IT comes into the picture very early. And really, the question is, where are you at the moment? Are you entirely on cash? Have you moved partially from cash to accrual? Or actually, are you in a position where actually the majority of entities already are reporting on an accrual basis, perhaps based on national accounting rules rather than, say, international public sector accounting standards? And so understanding that situation across the entities involved in the scope of the reforms is going to be really important. Are you bringing them all in at the same point in time, or is there a phased implementation? Do you need to have parallel running of cash and accrual? Those are the sorts of things that will influence the nature of the IT implementation, and also the complexity as well. Can it be done with existing systems? Do you need new systems? So those are all the sorts of things that you'll need to think about. And certainly I've seen in a number of jurisdictions, if you don't get that right to begin with, it will come back and cause problems later. Also understanding the nature of the information that you hold at the moment. Classically, in an implementation of accrual accounting, there will be big challenges in terms of bringing together asset information, valuing assets and so on. Liabilities can also be particularly problematic. But also, you know, are you going to change the approach to accounting for taxation? That will have particular practical problems associated with it. So knowing those sorts of things is very important. And then, are you planning to change systems across all the government ministries? You know, or are you actually going to use existing systems, draw that information together through the consolidation system? All of those factors will influence the design and program management from an IT perspective, and inevitably then they will also have an influence in terms of cost. So are there adequate budgets? Are those budgets available when you need them? All of those are important questions. And whilst I'm on the subject of systems, I think thinking this issue through about, is it just an accounting reform, or are you planning to use that information more broadly? That's really crucial, because my own personal view is that actually if you're going to get the real benefit from accrual, you actually need an integrated solution. Certainly this was a slide that my predecessor, Andreas Bergman, who's sitting in the audience, it's certainly Andreas's favourite slide. And really what it's saying is, actually to get the benefits, you need to use accrual information all the way through the cycle, which means from a budget point of view, it means monitoring performance in year, using that information for government finance statistics, then that being integrated with the annual reports, and those being audited, which gives you the independent assurance in terms of the quality of the information. That needs to be joined up, which will influence the planning. Thinking then in terms of capacity, I've mentioned the importance of the project team, not just technical expertise within the project team. It's going to be a big change program that you're talking about, even if the jurisdiction is already essentially mainly on accrual. So you need those skills within the team, and you do need a separate team as well. It isn't just something that people can do in their spare time. You need to think about the skills in government departments as well. Do they have adequate knowledge technically, both of systems, but also in terms of accrual accounting? How do you get that? Can you provide that within the organisation? Do you take a train the trainers approach? How do you do that in terms of timeliness and so on? Not just the accountants within the organisation, how's the audit office actually going to handle the change? Similar challenges in terms of technical knowledge, but also, and I think this is very important, the audit office itself will need to operate in a different way, because if they're auditing cash accounts, they need to actually have the right infrastructure to form professional judgments. And also, how do they coordinate those judgments? That will require changes. So I've mentioned IT, I've mentioned capacity building, and this is something that those of you involved in project management will be familiar with, that there actually is a trade-off between the costs, the budget that you have available for changes, how quickly you propose to implement, and also quality. And certainly that's one of the things that maybe doesn't get thought about in these changes, is actually the quality issue. It might not be perhaps popular, but certainly my own experience on this is things won't go perfectly. It's better to actually publish accounts rather than wait until they're perfect. Actually, if there are qualifications and so on, be honest about that. Once you publish the accounts, the pressure that you'll get will actually help sort those things out. So it's important to think about quality, but certainly when you're planning, think about the time. And Study 14 gives you examples of reform periods. This will inevitably take time. It recommends a 4 to 6 year time frame for changes. If you go longer than that, you will end up in a situation where people will never believe that this is going to happen. 6 or 7 years, people can't see that. They'll think, I'm going to leave my job before I get to that. If you need to implement the change in a shorter time, you're going to have a very strong political backing and probably also an increased budget. On the subject of time frame for implementation, IPSASB has a standard, IPSAS 33, on first-time implementation. It's worth looking at that because it brings in the idea about what we call dry run periods, so actually preparing accounts before you actually have to publish them in order to actually address some of the practical changes that you'll need to think about, and also some of the transitional arrangements that are actually allowed within the standards. Build those into your project plan. Final words before I get the next slide from Dimitri telling me that I've only got about a minute or so to go. Thinking about the project management, do think about the approach. Is it what you would call a big bang all in one go, or are you going to phase it across different levels of government? Are you focusing on implementation for individual organisations and then a consolidation later? All of those need to be brought together in terms of how you actually manage the programme. I think it's very important in basically implementation to be clear about what's expected from entities at certain points in time and people within the entities, that they are actually clear about what they've got to do and what they've got to deliver. In order to be able to monitor what's going on, you can issue guidance when you're sitting at the centre. You need an appropriate framework with feedback at various points on what's going on out there. That's where working closely with the audit office can be very beneficial, because you get independent evidence about what's going on out there. People can't just say, well, we're doing it. Actually, there's evidence that they're doing it. And you need that feedback, because if things aren't going right, if the guidance isn't giving them what they need, you need to be able to correct that, to provide additional training and so on. So the theme throughout all of this is actually you need to be able to plan appropriately. So I would summarise that by saying upfront, you need a clear gap analysis or a scoping study that analyzes where are you at this point in time, where do you want to get to in terms of the scope and coverage of the reforms, and then the how. How do we get there? And certainly I've been there. I've actually had a roadmap given to me about how do I do this public sector consolidation. When you actually go into it and you actually really do the detailed project plan, there's a lot to think about, and you may find that what people thought was initially possible isn't in the timeframes when you go into it. So really, you need that detailed roadmap right up front. And I'll leave you with the final thought that failing to plan is planning to fail. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Jan. A continuación pasamos la palabra a M, que nos va a platicar un poco de la experiencia de Estados Unidos en la materia.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I work in the U.S. Treasury in our accounting policy office. So we set government-wide financial and accounting policy for the whole of the U.S. government. So we produce our consolidated financial statements in our office, but we also, in recent years, have been running a website called usaspending.gov. So I'm going to talk with you today about some of the, we think, exciting reforms that we've been taking over the last few years to, go beyond. We've spent many years building a robust repository of financial data. We've also have many laws and requirements for not only financial information, but budget information, and procurement information, and grants and loans and other requirements and other systems that aren't linked easily, and we can't combine that. We haven't been able to combine that data, readily in the U.S. government. And so at Treasury, we've been leading some reforms that are allowing us to do that now for the first time. So I wanted to share some of our work with you here today. So, there's an increasing demand for data. I'm sure that many of you are experiencing that same the same desire, and I think our plenary session this morning, noted that we really have to start thinking about how we utilize this data to determine program outcomes and performance, and how we link our financial data with other existing information across our governments. So in the U.S., we've had quite a few barriers to doing that, and so a lot of the data has been locked away in fragmented and siloed systems. A lot of the data is really complex. It can't be linked in an easy way. There's a lot of competing standards. We have so many standards depending on what policy areas or management functions you provide and you work in your expertise, and they often don't communicate or work together. And so we've been undertaking an effort over the last 3 years to bring those communities and that data together in a way that we hope will pay off into some operational improvements and other savings across the government. In 2014, I think some of my example here is going to dovetail with Ian's presentation very nicely as an example of why we actually do, I think, having the first open data law requiring the U.S. government to consolidate and report all this information in a way that the public and policymakers will be able to understand where federal funds go from the level of where our Congress appropriates it from the legislative branch all the way down to where it is distributed within our communities at the state and local levels, at different levels of our government. So we've been working on that law for the past 3 years. The law passed on May 9th of 2014, and our statutory deadline to report this data for the first time was May 9th of 2017, so last month, and I'm happy to say that we met our deadline. So today I'm going to talk with you about what we did, but also most importantly, how we did it. I think that the approach that we've taken was innovative for our government. We took a different approach than we have with other IT efforts in the past in the financial management space, and I think we learned some lessons that hopefully maybe you could benefit from. So the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act that passed in 2014 required the Treasury, along with the rest of the federal agencies that are across the federal government, to track $3.8 trillion on a quarterly basis, and we have to combine the data from our budget, accounting, procurement, and financial assistance areas and present that all to the public in a clear and transparent way. So, that's a big task. And, we have a big challenge to collect, store, and display all that information to the public from over 100 different federal agencies in our U.S. government, and to do it within a 3-year time frame, which is what we were up against. And so, this is a large data set. It represents about 20% of the U.S. GDP. So it's also a very high-value data set, we believe, because if we can get more granular information, it's not only going to help us as the U.S. government manage our resources better, it's going to also be a tool for the private sector or for state and other governments or others around the world who want to analyze that information. So, collecting it and distributing it in a clear and straightforward way, I think, has value to many communities, and we wanted to make sure we realize that value. So I talked, I think we have to start with, we do have a lot of limitations and challenges with this work. We really, as I joined the Treasury team to work on this, we were kind of wondering, well, how are we going to do this within this short time frame and with very limited resources? The U.S. Treasury got some modest funds to implement this law, but many federal agencies that have to supply the data didn't receive any new funding. So how are we going to do this quickly and at a low cost? And so, with all of the challenges that I'm noting on the screen here, a lot of, there's no enterprise-wide definitions or taxonomy to build off of. And so we approached this in a very different way, which we went to the leading technologists in the U.S. government and said, okay, how can we do this? What are the latest advances in technology that you all see from the private sector that we might be able to adapt in the public space? And they really encouraged us to take on the agile development methodology that has been pretty common in the private sector in the past decade, but really adopt it and embrace it at the government level. And so we took their advice. And so we started small. We said, we think that we can tag and map all of the required financial data from across the U.S. government and bring it together in a common model and then report that information. So we picked one agency, one rather small agency in the U.S. government, and we tried it. We created a prototype. We said, this was what we think will work. And we tweaked it a little bit along the way, but it in fact did work. And so we did create an information model, the Data Act Information Model Schema, which provides the overall context for the view of more than 400 data elements that every agency supplies to us for all their transactions that, to make up that $3.8 trillion of annual federal spend that we had. The information model includes technical guidance, authoritative sources for all of this data. So when you have obligation defined differently within the grant community than in the accounting community, what are you going to report? And so we identified what are the authoritative sources for what we're going to present to the public on this online disclosure that we're creating. Each of the communities maintain their own standards and their own, principles that they feel very passionate about. But how do we bring this information together in a way that people can understand it, that it can be used for data analytic purposes? So we reached these standards through a multi-year process, and we finalized them in April of 2016. They are in alignment with industry standardization requirements and XBRL. And we also thought it was really important, and one of the key points and goals of the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act was to make sure that the public can understand this. So it's not just written in things that we in this room may understand, but it's something that the citizen or a journalist or those who aren't accountants can actually pick up and hopefully trace where their money goes and understand the value that their government provides. A little bit more about the open implementation approach that we took. As I mentioned, we decided not to change all the standards for all the different communities. We took a data-centric approach. So we took the 400 elements that we know that were required by law, and we identified where they resided in every agency. We mapped that information, and we brought it together in a central place at Treasury. So we used the agile development. We put out our initial prototype probably 2 years before we were required to start reporting the data, and we got agency feedback. Agencies came to us and brought their test data and sample data, and they actually used this sample prototype, and they gave us feedback. They told us why that wouldn't work for them or what they needed along the way. And our team worked on 2-week cycles. So if an agency gave us feedback, and 2 weeks later, they would see that feedback addressed in the new prototype, and they would test it again and again. And that's how we built this model over time. And I tell you, my colleagues who worked at Treasury much longer than I have, they've never seen a system developed as quickly and work as well as the one that we've developed. Usually in a traditional kind of IT development approach, it would take, you set the requirements, and then you wait a couple years, and you invest a lot of resources, and then you get to the results. And you're like, oh, it's not exactly what we needed, right? I mean, that's not an uncommon experience, unfortunately, in government. But we found that this process, because we tweaked and revised and got user engagement all along the way from the federal agencies who had to supply the data to us, the product and the system that we built works smoothly. In fact, with our first reporting deadline last month, we were kind of shocked by how smoothly things went, and the data got in very, quickly and without, few complications. So we were very pleased with that. The other piece of our open implementation is open source code. So the tool that we built to bring all of the data together across the US government is, we call it a broker, and the broker is actually open source code. So Treasury ourselves, we built this tool quickly, but now if another agency within the government, if the Department of Education wants to take the code that Treasury built, because they want to put those same validations and those same testing functions within their own environment at their agency, they can just take Treasury's code and put it in their own environment. They don't have to spend more money to develop, their own systems and their own code. They can utilize ours. It's also open to the public. So the public knows that they can test and they can see everything that's in our system, everything that's on our website. We have an open source code policy for all the tools that we developed. And the last thing I'm going to talk a little bit more about is the user-centered research. User-centered research is a common practice also. Oops, I got a little ahead. I spoke about the agile development. We had different agile development teams. I think one of the most important parts on the agile development, just to go back to that, is to have consistent executive engagement. Our fiscal assistant secretary at the U.S. Treasury, held, every 2 weeks meetings, so he knew what was going on this work. And the executive involvement all along was very critical and important. I think that speaks to a lot of the things that Ian was just mentioning. So we've had very senior level involvement, but we've also given our technical teams the flexibilities that they need to make the best decisions in order to be responsive to the users, whether it be an agency or the public. So, and when I said we worked in 2-week cycles. All of our website design that goes along with producing and publishing this data, the whole process has all been open for public input. The public gave us input onto the standards that we developed. While we had requirements in law, we did, as we were developing all of the final standards, we had a public comment period. Everything was put online. There was a public way to comment. All of that information was open to the public at every step of the way. We also released in November of 2015 a website called openbeta.usaspending.gov. So we basically built the new website to disclose all this information in the public. So when we would design a page, we'd put it up for the public to input and provide us input on it. We also conducted user interviews. We also, put all of our work that we were doing online so the public could see it. So in this example I'm highlighting here, it says, as a researcher, I want to be able to add columns to the award table on the search results page. So that's a piece of feedback that we receive from somebody who is a researcher and they want to be able to do custom sorting on our website of the data. So this is the actual to-do list from our development team, and it's in the public domain, so that the person who made this comment can now see that our team is working on that capability, and they know who is working on it and when it will be complete. So the transparency at every step of what we're doing has been there, and I think it's fostered an increase in the trust of the data and the process, and we hope to see more of that in the future. But every step of what we've done has been open to the public for this reason. User-centered design. This is something I was talking about previously. I think in government we often design websites and we think, oh, will be helpful. This will be helpful to the public. But I think sometimes we don't understand all the different users who use the information that we put out there. And so one of the things that we were very structured about in our process is we had a user-centered design where we actually identified different personas of the people who are likely to use our site. So this is a sample here of a recipient, someone who receives money from our federal government. What are the things they're looking for in the data? We also looked at, the average citizen. We looked at journalists. We looked at states. We looked at academics. We looked at all different sectors to make sure that we were accommodating their desires and needs in the new site. And we grounded all of the new features based on this research. Even when as a financial management person or an accountant, I'm like, I don't know if that makes sense. But at all points, we really did try to stick to the research, and that this is what it's told us, and it even challenged some of our own conventional thinking about how we think we should be sharing information. So it was we found it a very rewarding process. So I probably am getting close on time. So I just want to highlight some of the lessons learned through this 3-year effort, and I'm always happy. I have a minute. Okay, I got to go fast. Happy to talk more with anybody afterwards, because as you can tell, we're really excited about the progress that we're making and the potential, but we're just starting. So some of the lessons that we've learned, we need consistent and active executive engagement. These agile teams, our folks were so dedicated to the mission and vision and the potential of the work that we're doing here, and the way that while we've got our initial data model in place, we think that it can be extended to a lot of other management and administrative data across U.S. government to link in performance, to link in greater detail on IT or HR, human resources, or other data sets that are out there that are not organized in a way that the agency officials can use the information. We focused on the users. We had a data-first approach. We didn't try to change every system in the government. We just figured out a model that could bring it together in a quick and easy way. Using open source tools, we know that the data that we put out isn't perfect. We published it last month. We were open and candid about that. And just like you said, you've got to start from somewhere, and we're putting it all out there. It was the first time this information had ever been brought together before. And so we're going to continue to work on it. We've made that commitment, and we're going to continue to work with agencies to make that data quality improvements over the coming months and years. And the last thing is just where you can find more information. Beta.usaspending.gov is a site where you can go and see all of this new data that we've recently published at Treasury. We launched this website last month. It's only got our first quarter reporting. You're going to be able to go, over the summer, we're migrating all 10 years worth of historical data on that website from the information that we've already been tracking over the last 10 years, but that data will continue to grow. And the next quarter will be, every month, every quarter it'll get a little better. And then if you're looking for information on our information model, it's the second link there that takes you to the portal where all the information on the standards and the information model are available. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Amy. Continuamos enseguida con la presentación de Sama.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm very happy to be here with you today and talk about accounting for PPPs. At the International Monetary Fund, we have developed a tool jointly with the World Bank to help you assess the fiscal implications from PPPs. These can be typically complex projects, so we created a user-friendly tool so you can start accounting for them properly. So why is this important at all? Why is accounting for PPPs important? Today, infrastructure needs around the world are very large. There's different estimates, but some say it's around $1 trillion annually for the world. And so many countries, we receive demands for private sector involvement, including PPPs, and so a lot of countries are asking for assistance because they're accelerating this program. And of course, they can bring efficiency relative to the traditional way of delivering infrastructure, but so why are we worried at the same time? Have you watched the Titanic before? So in this context, we call it the fiscal iceberg. We have seen that many countries leading up to the financial crisis have paid a lot for these hidden off-balance sheet liabilities that materialized. In the case of Portugal, Greece, for example, about 10% of GDP in debt was moved and became firm debt. So this is the reason why we think it's important that we have transparent reporting, accounting, and budgeting for these complex arrangements. So what are currently the international standards? There are 3 different pillars. budgeting, accounting, and statistical reporting. In terms of budgeting for PPPs, it's very important that you not only report for them in budget documents, but you also budget for them in the medium-term fiscal framework. So in here, the relevant international standard is the IMF Fiscal Transparency Code. More than budgeting, it's also important to follow accounting standards because these can be the base for fiscal targets or fiscal rules. So in this regard, IPSAS 32, Service Concession Arrangements Grantor, that was passed in 2011, is the standard that we are using for accounting for PPPs. And finally, on statistical reporting, you basically need to report PPPs in your headline fiscal indicators, in deficit and in debt. And the standards here are the GFSM 2014 manual from the IMF and the Public Sector Debt Guide from 2011. So of course, in the best case scenario, all these three approaches would be consistent with each other, but obviously this is not the case in many countries, and so many countries are in transition. They could be accounting based on accrual basis, but their budgeting, as my colleague has mentioned, is still not on accrual basis. Or the statistics are not following the accounting basis for PPPs. So this should be enhanced. So let me tell you about the IPSAS 32 standard, how it works for public-private partnerships, because it is the basis for this tool that we have developed. So this is a very strict standard in terms of accounting for PPPs. Basically, if you have imagine you have a road project, PPP, you have to decide the non-financial asset that is behind this PPP. Is it going to be on the public sector balance sheet or the private sector balance sheet? And you do this based on the control approach. So IPSAS has developed a series of, it's a decision tree to decide who controls this asset. And in most cases, probably you will determine that the government controls this asset for most PPP projects. And if you do, then regardless whether the private sector actually finances, even if they finance the project 100%, you can still put the whole thing on the balance sheet of the government. So this has, if you were to fully capture this, it has serious implications for your fiscal statistics, your debt and your deficit, and for your fiscal sustainability analysis. So typically when we share this, this information about the standard with country authorities, they are very surprised to learn that most PPPs will go on their balance sheet. And the reason is they have in mind maybe some form of ideal PPP project. For example, it could be 100% user fees. It does not transfer to the government at the end of the contract, and the government doesn't provide any guarantees. So in this case, yes, you would determine that the impact on fiscal deficit and debt is marginal, and the government might even share revenues with the private from this contract. However, the most projects that we have looked at, so we are piloting our tool for many contracts. When we look at them, we assess that so far all of the ones we have done should be on the balance sheet of the government. So the bottom line is that implementing IPSAS 32 will have implications for your deficit, debt, balance sheet, the same way as a traditional procured project would have. So it's meant to kind of remove this bias of committing something for the future because you don't have to spend cash right away for the construction of the asset, so you can just pay over a longer period of time. So this removes the bias inherent, and so you can focus on selecting those priority projects so you can reap the efficiency gains from doing the PPP approach. So it is a strict approach, you might say, and a lot of countries are not on accrual standards yet, but the practice is a lot of countries have already adopted IPSAS 32. For example, Australia and New Zealand even account based on accrual standards for PPPs. And Peru, Colombia, and the region have moved their accounting standards to IPSAS 32. And I understand that Chile is also planning to move, I think, by 2018. If you are on a cash basis, don't think that there's nothing you can do. I think you should still start moving towards this approach. And even in our IMF programs, we have been recommending countries to treat, so even if you're not on accrual basis, just pretend that as if you are for your, for your large PPP projects. I mean, we've seen PPP projects of 5–10% of GDP in asset value. And so for these projects, if we have a program with a country, we will typically just treat them on balance sheet, even if the country is not on accrual basis yet. So let me tell you about this tool that we have developed with the World Bank and how it can help you. Hopefully a lot of you can use it or recommend it to accountants or statisticians or people working at the Ministry of Finance in your countries. So the reason we developed this tool is because a lot of countries were coming to us, or a lot of our own teams, with very large contracts. I don't know if you've seen a PPP contract before, but some of them can be 200 pages with schedules and annexes. So it can be intimidating for an accountant who doesn't have some experience in legal aspects of understanding what do I do with this. And so, I mean, I was trained as an economist, but I have learned, it's been 5 years now, and I have learned to read a contract. So that's great. I even can read a PPP law now, so you can do it too. And basically, the reason this Excel tool is great is because it follows a user-friendly approach. So it tells you what are the key elements that you need. It asks you, what is the construction cost? So this is what you need to know. How many years does construction last? And in case you don't have some data, for example, on maintenance costs, we can assume something in the Excel tool. So it is meant to assess one project at a time. So you don't want to do it for like a project that is only 0.1% of GDP. Maybe you want to start with your largest projects with the largest impact. And it is consistent with both IPSAS 32 and GFSM 2014. And it produces statements on cash, accrual basis, flow, and stock. So the way it works is it guides you through a series of questions following the decision tree of IPSAS to determine if this project should belong on the public or private sector balance sheet. It asks you to enter some data from the contract, and it asks you to enter some macro data because we include some shocks for GDP, exchange rate, inflation that could impact how this project affects fiscal indicators. So what does it produce? 3 main things. It basically produces what the impact of this PPP should be for your statistics and accounts. It gives you a summary risk matrix so you can understand how risk is shared between the government and the private for various risks. And you can do some sensitivity analysis for various shocks or termination, for example. So this is the decision tree. It's basically 5 questions. It asks you who initiates the project. Is it somebody from the central, local, state-owned enterprise, control of the asset, how is the payment done, whether there are any guarantees offered, like minimum revenue guarantees, debt guarantees, etc. And these are the kind of outcomes that come. For example, this is a PPP project that starts in year 2014. So it shows you from the moment that the contract starts construction until the end of the contract, what is the impact of this PPP on the private sector expected cash flows and on the fiscal tables for liabilities, non-financial assets, accrual balance, and cash balance. Then there are the financial statements, income statement, balance sheet, cash statement, and it shows you the impact on your debt, without the PPP and with the PPP. So that's in red. So to see how this PPP alters your balances and debt. And here is the sensitivity analysis. For example, this one, you can choose that what if this project terminates for some reason in year 2020? Then obviously your PPP debt would go to zero, but this would have a large impact on your cash balance in the year of termination. Finally, one nice aspect of this tool is that it gives you a synthetic view of the fiscal risk-sharing arrangements. So we identified 11 risks that could potentially materialize in a given PPP. So for example, you have a construction risk, the risk that you have overruns and construction cost, or demand risk. For example, the private might not recuperate all the demand that was projected, and they might come to the government and say, you know, I'm not collecting enough demand, user revenue, so they might ask for increase in tariffs, etc. So here we determine, we ask the user to fill out kind of how is this risk allocated? Is it public, private, shared? The second column is what is the likelihood that this is going to materialize? Is it low, medium, high likelihood? And if it were to materialize, what would be the fiscal impact? Is it low, medium, high? And the last columns, the risk rating is simply a function of the likelihood and the fiscal impact. So if a risk, for example, number 3, demand risk, if a risk is highly likely and it would have a high fiscal impact, then this would be it would have a critical risk rating. Then it would ask you, do you have a mitigation strategy in place? Does the government have a mitigation strategy? If no, which is the case in demand risks, then you would say, well, this is a very highly priority area. So basically it gives you kind of an order of priority of what risks you need to manage or look at more carefully. So in conclusion, yes, PPPs can offer higher efficiency than traditional way of delivering infrastructure, but you need to be vigilant and manage the fiscal risks and properly and transparently account and report for them. And even when you do budget and account and report properly, you still need to do an overall fiscal risk assessment that takes into account the correlation of various fiscal risks that could materialize. So I hope this tool could be useful for you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have on it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Sama. Tenemos dos participaciones más. A continuación vamos a escuchar las experiencias de México, que siguió un camino un tanto diferente a la mayoría de los países de la región. Vamos hablando del esfuerzo de la reforma de la Ley General de Contabilidad Gubernamental, el esfuerzo de armonización contable nacional que ha promovido México en los últimos años. Y después vamos a escuchar la experiencia de Chile con una experiencia relacionada directamente con la implementación y convergencia con las normas internacionales de contabilidad del sector público. Antes de finalizar la sesión voy a tratar de hacer un pequeño resumen y en el tiempo restante vamos a tratar de tomar 2 o 3 preguntas del auditorio, así que si tienen alguna duda o inquietud, favor de tenerla lista para plantearla enseguida al finalizar las presentaciones. Muchas gracias, María Teresa.
Muchas gracias. Doy la bienvenida a todos los que nos acompañan a este bello país. Sean bienvenidos. Para ponernos en contexto, México está integrado por 32 entidades federativas. De punta a punta tenemos una distancia de aproximadamente 4.500 kilómetros. Se hablan más de 60 lenguas indígenas y al año 2015 la encuesta reflejaba 119.530.753 habitantes. Los niveles de gobierno, tenemos 3, el federal, estatal y municipal. Cada uno tiene autonomía, los estados son libres y soberanos y todos los entes que conformamos la federación, los estados y los municipios somos más de 6.077 entes públicos. ¿En qué converge todos los niveles de gobierno, que hoy nos rige una única ley, la Ley General de Contabilidad Gubernamental. Esta ley tiene un órgano que regula en materia normativa en contabilidad gubernamental, que es el CONAC, es el Consejo Nacional de Armonización Contable. El CONAC se instala en el 2009, se hace la designación del comité y sus reglas de operación, emite los postulados básicos, define los momentos contables de los ingresos y de los egresos, da los clasificadores de presupuestos, lineamientos de indicadores. En el 2010 emite el plan de cuentas, el manual de contabilidad gubernamental, las reglas de registro y valoración del patrimonio, el marco metodológico para que cada uno de estos entes integre sus respectivas cuentas públicas, y en el 2013 hay una reforma donde se señala el título quinto, que esto es en materia de transparencia, donde todos y cada uno de esos 6,000 entes tienen que informar de la misma manera, con los mismos formatos y con una periodicidad uniforme. Hubo un diagnóstico para que esto no fuéramos juez y parte, y en ese diagnóstico fue remitido a la Cámara, tanto de diputados como de senadores, para que tuvieran una visión de dónde estábamos y qué nos hacía falta. Como toda ley, su implementación es lo más tormentoso, porque la emisión es una cuestión política, pero poder aterrizar todas estas atribuciones que cada uno tenía, fuimos emitiendo a lo largo de esta ley distintos artículos transitorios, donde se daba un plazo y no alcanzaba, no se cumplía y entonces se daba una prórroga y después se daba otra prórroga y así hasta que llegamos a 2015. Aquí están las distintas acciones. En el 2010 se da la prórroga para la armonización de los sistemas contables. En el 2011 se definen los registros contables, sus catálogos de cuentas, la emisión de información y los sistemas de contabilidad gubernamental en tiempo real. En 2012 se definen los registros contables del patrimonio y su evaluación. Se publica la información contable, presupuestaria y programática. En el 2014 hay un acuerdo de CONAC para ampliar esos plazos, dando cumplimiento a dichas obligaciones, y en el 2015 se llega al nivel más bajo, que son los municipios, que tenemos más de 2,000 municipios en este país. Fue en diciembre del 2015 cuando fue la fecha límite para la armonización contable. Estos son los pasos por los que México atravesó. Tuvo que hacer una reforma en su Constitución en el 2008. En el 2009 se emite la Ley General de Contabilidad Gubernamental, se publica el 31 de diciembre del 2008, hubo una reforma viendo el avance de esta ley, donde se determina la fiscalización y la intervención de la Auditoría Superior de la Federación para que ellos pudieran tener los insumos y pudieran darnos el diagnóstico correspondiente. En 2013, diversos fondos que se reparten a las entidades federativas, se hace una reforma donde en México hace una descentralización en materia educativa de los recursos, pero a la vez una reforma para tener el registro de todos y cada uno de los maestros que integran este país, y una reforma en el 2013. En 2015, CONAC no es suficiente porque no tiene una estructura orgánica y a pesar de ser una autoridad competente, es integrada por el secretario de Hacienda como presidente, lo integran distintos gobernadores de las entidades federativas, los cuales van rotando, representantes de municipios, que son los presidentes municipales, el auditor superior de la federación, y en ese comité yo soy la secretaria técnica. Ese secretario técnico del CONAC en el 2015 hace espejos en cada entidad federativa, que son los consejos estatales de armonización contable, de tal manera que ya señalé anteriormente que tenemos 32 entidades federativas y en consecuencia 32 consejos estatales. En 2014 se hace una reforma para la Ley de Disciplina Financiera, que es para controlar las finanzas públicas sanas en las entidades federativas, y en 2016 la Ley de Fiscalización y Rendición de Cuentas de la Federación. Vamos a hablar acerca de cómo han servido estos consejos de armonización en las entidades federativas para poder aterrizar e implementar de una manera más acelerada la ley general. El 29 de febrero de 2016 se emiten las reglas de operación, se publican en el Diario Oficial de la Federación y en estas reglas se hace la definición de las atribuciones de cada consejo estatal, se da el establecimiento de la participación de la Auditoría Superior de la Federación. Aquí es muy importante destacar la participación. Anteriormente, la Secretaría de Hacienda hacía la evaluación en materia de armonización contable, pero también era la que implementaba estas normas autorizadas por el CONAC. Es en la reforma del 2015 donde ya no tiene la atribución Hacienda y ahora la Auditoría Superior, como un ente autónomo, juega un rol muy importante porque ellos son los que hoy evalúan en materia de armonización contable los avances correspondientes. Se crea la herramienta tecnológica para tener comunicación entre CONAC, que es el órgano regulador, y todos estos CONACs estatales, una herramienta de comunicación, de avisos, de dudas, que es el PCAC, el Portal de Armonización Contable. Y se define una presentación del informe de resultados sobre los avances en armonización contable que año con año se manda al Congreso. Hoy día la página de CONAC cuenta con la información de las cuentas públicas y sus avances de todas y cada una de las entidades federativas, donde se determina el avance que han tenido cada una de estas entidades de acuerdo a rangos y a metodologías que determina la Auditoría Superior. Lo interesante de este proceso en México es que hoy ya pudimos llegar hasta nivel municipal. Eso no se había logrado, a pesar de que la reforma fue en el 2008, apenas el año pasado se pudo llegar a los municipios y logramos tener aproximadamente el 83% de cobertura en todos los municipios, con un total de 2.055 municipios, donde hoy se encuentran ya el avance de sus cuentas públicas con formatos homologados que emitió CONAC. Para poder hacer esto posible, y dado que en México la rotación de los municipios, su legislación es cada 3 años, hay mucha rotación de personal. Y esto nos hace muy difícil la implementación. Constantemente hay que estar capacitando y la capacitación pues se requiere muchos recursos públicos, cada día el presupuesto es más escaso y lo que hicimos es apoyarnos de las tecnologías, hacer capacitaciones virtuales y con apoyo de la Auditoría Superior de la Federación se dan capacitación a distintos servidores públicos, logrando el año pasado capacitar a 45.991 servidores públicos en diversos temas de contabilidad gubernamental. Otro avance es que con la Auditoría Superior se está haciendo un sistema para evaluar el avance en armonización contable, donde va a emitir los informes correspondientes. Tenemos un portal de cuentas públicas donde se mete de una manera muy simplificada en un formato de Excel la balanza de comprobación y a través de reglas de negocio podemos obtener los formatos armonizados que determina CONAC. Otro avance es que para los municipios que tienen pocos recursos, CONAC está ofreciendo de manera gratuita una herramienta para llevar la contabilidad, que es el CIMCA, y este también se encuentra con apoyo de la Auditoría Superior. ¿Cuáles serían los retos que tiene México? Pues seguir con la cobertura, mejorar la calidad de la información, continuar con el apoyo de capacitación, señalo, por esta alta rotación que tenemos con los servidores públicos, lograr llegar a todos y cada uno de los municipios que integra este país y hacer una homologación de criterios. Ahora, CONAC es un órgano colegiado y en muchos foros me preguntan, ¿se acercan a las normas internacionales? CONAC, en su órgano colegiado, aprobamos las normas, procurando siempre apegar a las normas internacionales. Sin embargo, no es hoy un requisito que cada norma tenga una aprobación de normas internacionales. Sin embargo, ese es también uno de los retos. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Teresa. Pasamos palabra a Yolanda para hacer la última presentación de esta tarde.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por la invitación. Ya le vamos a contar un poco la experiencia de Chile en lo que es ya la implementación de las normas. Un poco, yo sé que muchos que a lo mejor ya se saben esta historia, pero tengo que hacer un contexto para que se entienda el proceso. En el caso de Chile, ya nosotros tenemos la facilidad, y fue dentro de las cosas que se vio como ventaja para el proceso, es que la Contraloría lleva el control y además lleva la contabilidad general de la Nación. Entonces, uno de los aspectos importantes de este proceso fue que no necesitamos de hacer una ley para poder decir que íbamos a hacer un proyecto de NIC-SP. El otro aspecto importante es que en el caso de Chile la contabilidad pública venía del año 1986 definiendo como el principio de devengo y puesta en marcha dentro de sus postulados básicos, y también tenía como definición la integración entre la contabilidad y el presupuesto. Todos sabemos que son declaraciones que son bonitas, pero que en la práctica hay que entender que eran declaraciones, pero que no estaba llevado el principio de devengo, el contexto de las NIC-SP, sino que tenía sus deficiencias. Otro aspecto importante fue el hecho de que desde el año 2004 teníamos dos elementos que nos facilitaban el proceso, que era que teníamos un sistema integrado, ¿ya?, que unía contabilidad, presupuesto y tesorería y también compromiso. Y el otro elemento, además adicional, es que el año 2004 se dicta el presupuesto base de vengado a través de la Dirección de Presupuesto, y eso permite que muchas operaciones se puedan registrar en mucho mejor forma, cumpliendo el principio de devengo, que hasta esa fecha teníamos mayores complicaciones. En ese escenario, ya, nosotros elaboramos este proyecto, el cual inicialmente ya solo contenía la etapa del diseño, que en el fondo era la elaboración de las normas. Ahí contamos, muchos de los que están en esta sala han sido parte de este proyecto, ¿ya? Bueno, Andreas Berman nos colaboró en el proyecto de hacer el plan de diseño de la norma, pero el plan tenía tres componentes: uno que era el de diseño propiamente tal, otro que tenía que ver con la capacitación, porque en Chile en realidad las NIC-SP eran totalmente desconocidas, y otro aspecto que era el de sistema. El tema de sistema realmente quedó muy relegado y avanzamos mucho en el tema de las normas. Ese proceso fue bastante participativo. Nosotros trabajamos con consultoras y con entidades públicas, porque entendíamos que esta norma requiere mucho de la participación de las entidades. No es una tarea que la pueda hacer un organismo normativo solo sin requerir, digamos, de la experiencia y del resto de las funciones. Este proceso, que es el proceso de diseño, termina con la dictación de la resolución 16 el año 2015. El año 2015 dictamos esta resolución, y esta resolución contiene las 32 normas NIC-SP emitidas a la fecha y contiene además el plan de cuenta, ¿ya? Ese es nuestro primer hito. Y a partir del año 2016 iniciamos lo que nosotros llamamos el periodo de implementación, que bajo nuestra normativa nosotros hemos definido un periodo de implementación coincidente con lo que hemos determinado como periodo de transición para cumplir y ser equivalente usando lo que es la NIC-SP 33. Que establece lo que es el periodo de transición. Entonces, en el caso de Chile se ha establecido un periodo de transición de 3 años, ¿ya?, del 2006 al 2018. Y posteriormente, bueno, este proceso de implementación es el que yo voy a entrar un poco más en detalle en contarles cómo lo hemos llevado a cabo. Y después definimos un periodo de post-implementación que entendemos que va a requerir hacer una serie de adecuaciones al respecto de lo que hemos inicialmente elaborado. Y también para nosotros este proyecto tiene mucho que ver con una lámina que mostró Ian, que dice presupuesto, contabilidad, auditoría, porque en el caso de Chile nosotros tenemos que avanzar hacia una auditoría de estado financiero. En Chile se hace auditoría de estado financiero, pero de determinadas entidades, pero no de la totalidad de la cobertura. Y este proceso para nosotros termina con la auditoría de estado financiero de las entidades que están participando en este proceso de implementación. Bueno, ahí les muestro lo que es la resolución 16. Junto con la resolución 16 que tiene el plan de cuenta, dictamos el manual de procedimiento, ya, de las 32 normas, y también dictamos lo que llamamos un instructivo de primera adopción, que en el fondo es la NIC-SP 33, pero también llevada a lo que es nuestra lógica de tomar adoptar las NIC-SP bajo una norma nacional, ¿ya? Y en este documento, que es el instructivo primera adopción, es donde nosotros hemos determinado el periodo de 3 años y también hemos determinado lo que es súper relevante, que es que durante este periodo todos los ajustes de primera adopción tienen que ser remitidos a la Contraloría para su visación. Eso nos va a permitir hacer un seguimiento de todos los ajustes que tengan relación con las NIC-SP durante el periodo de transición. Bueno, ahí les muestro lo que es el periodo total. El 2016 indicamos que era un periodo de aplicación general. Aquellos servicios que quieran usar el periodo de transición 2017-2018 tienen que pedir autorización a la Contraloría para explicar las razones por las cuales necesitan ese periodo de transición, para que nosotros podamos evaluar que están ajustados a la IPSAS 33, es decir, que corresponden a activos, bienes militares, infraestructura pública concesionada y que cumple con los requisitos de la norma. A la fecha, ya nosotros tenemos el siguiente esquema, ahí les mostramos, tenemos un 43% de servicios que no han necesitado periodo de transición, ya, un 25% que estaría solicitando los 3 años y un 32% que ha solicitado el periodo de 2 años. Pero ¿qué nos ha ido pasando? Esto es bastante dinámico. Muchos de los que el año 2016 dijeron que no requerían periodo de transición, este año 2017 están pidiendo hacer uso de ese periodo. Y eso tiene que ver con algo que les voy a indicar después. Otro aspecto importante que hemos querido nosotros durante todo este proceso, hacer un seguimiento respecto de lo que las entidades están haciendo con la norma para poder entender la real comprensión de lo que está llegando a las instituciones de la NIC-SP. Y en ese contexto nosotros le hemos pedido a las entidades que hagan un plan de implementación, para lo cual la Contraloría dio una metodología de plan con la ayuda del BID. Hemos elaborado esta metodología de plan de implementación, ya, el cual se separa en 4 áreas. Una que es el área normativa, donde las entidades tienen que analizar la brecha con la norma, otra que tiene que ver con la gestión del conocimiento, ¿no es cierto?, con la gestión del cambio y con el tema de los procesos y sistemas. Esa metodología fue entregada a las instituciones, ya, a través de una guía, y cada una de las entidades tuvo que remitirnos sus planes de implementación analizando cada una de las normas. Eso en la actualidad es como les mostramos ahí a ustedes, tenemos un 79% de entidades que han entregado sus planes y tenemos un 23% o 22%, no me veo bien, de entidades que aún no nos entregan el plan, ¿ya? Con ellas estamos haciendo ahí un trabajo para asesorarlos porque ha sido complejo en su preparación. Juntamente con eso hemos desarrollado, ¿no es cierto?, en esta fase un sistema de apoyo a la implementación, que le llamamos ISAI. En ese sistema vamos a hacer un monitoreo de los planes, pero también queremos hacer un monitoreo de todas las experiencias exitosas que las entidades van teniendo respecto al desarrollo de la norma. Porque claramente, una vez que la Contraloría dicta estas normas, ¿no es cierto?, tenemos el problema de ver cómo se desarrolla en cada uno de los negocios de cada servicio público. Ya es bien distinto un Ministerio de Obras Públicas que tiene concesión, infraestructura pública, a un hospital o a un servicio como la misma Contraloría General que tiene una dinámica distinta. Entonces, a través de este portal pretendemos hacer un acompañamiento de los planes. En este contexto, ya yo quise hacer un listado de los retos que nosotros estamos encontrando hasta esta fecha y donde nosotros pensamos que los organismos internacionales y los mismos países podemos colaborar, ¿ya? ¿Qué nos hemos dado cuenta? Que a pesar de que hicimos una capacitación inicial, la idea de generar capacidades nuevas en los equipos de trabajo es muy necesaria para el acompañamiento de esta norma. Esto que antes de implementar la norma nosotros solo lo deletreábamos, que decíamos que para ir a esta norma se requerían equipos multidisciplinarios. Pero efectivamente, cuando empezamos a implementar la norma nos damos cuenta que si no se cuenta con eso, llega el contador solo y no sabe responder preguntas de bien intangible, no puede comprender realmente un deterioro de un activo fijo. Entonces, este discurso de que tenemos que los contadores trabajar con equipos interdisciplinarios dentro de las entidades es muy relevante. Otro tema importante para nosotros como reto es el tema de la capacitación permanente. ¿Por qué? Porque nos hemos dado cuenta de que no sea, como estamos recibiendo los ajustes de primera adopción, y también está una norma que no la he mencionado acá, pero la norma de errores tiene una implicancia muy relevante para la Contraloría, ¿Por qué? Porque como la norma exige que todos los ajustes de errores de años anteriores sean a los saldos iniciales, además nosotros en la Contraloría nos gusta complicarnos la vida. Entonces, además dentro de la norma pusimos un requisito que todos los ajustes a los saldos iniciales deben contar con la autorización de la Contraloría. Entonces nos mandan todos los comprobantes y toda la información para que nosotros validemos esos ajustes. Pero eso nos ha permitido darnos cuenta de estas cosas que yo les estoy mencionando ahora. De esto, de la mala interpretación de las normas. Por ejemplo, nos llegan situaciones en las cuales ajustan y creen que no hacen la diferencia entre una mala determinación de una vida útil de un activo y el deterioro, por ejemplo. Entonces, es relevante, nosotros vemos, empezar a capacitar, seguir en la capacitación y ya capacitar quizás con elementos más focalizados a diferentes áreas. Bueno, dentro de eso, también nosotros hemos tenido otro proyecto en el cual nos apoyó el Banco Mundial, que es una capacitación en modalidad e-learning, que nos ha permitido claramente llegar a un número mucho más importante de funcionarios públicos, y no solo funcionarios públicos, sino que también tenemos un plan que abarca del 2016 al 2019, en el cual también vamos a incorporar a otras áreas de negocio dentro de los servicios públicos. El otro aspecto, como ustedes se dan cuenta, es el monitoreo permanente de lo que es la reforma, el seguimiento. Yo siento que entender que cuando partimos con la implementación tenemos necesariamente que hacer un seguimiento porque se nos van a quedar cosas en el camino y vamos a tener que hacer más precisiones. Y el otro elemento importante que también nos hemos dado cuenta es el tema de la valorización de los activos y pasivos. Porque claramente nosotros, yo les dije, tenemos los manuales de procedimiento, podemos contabilizar las concesiones, podemos contabilizar la incorporación de la infraestructura pública, estimaciones y provisiones, pero al momento de ponerle valor a esos asientos contables, entramos en el problema, ¿ya? Las metodologías de valorización de la infraestructura pública, de los bienes del patrimonio histórico, ya nosotros tenemos ahí una norma en la cual hicimos un primer paso de querer avanzar hacia los bienes del patrimonio histórico. El tema de las concesiones, ya también todo lo que tiene que ver con beneficio a los empleados. Ahí tenemos una serie de elementos que yo siento que los organismos internacionales, con la experiencia que tienen, nos pueden ayudar para determinar mejores metodologías de valorización. Otro aspecto que estamos desarrollando y creemos que podíamos compartir como países es el de guías prácticas, el de compartir casos. En el caso de Chile estamos preparando ahora una guía práctica de bienes intangibles que la pondremos a disposición de todos ustedes cuando la tengamos totalmente elaborada y pensamos que en todas las áreas sería muy importante contar con estas guías. Otro tema importante que yo les mencionaba que fue para nosotros un poco deficiente fue el tema de los sistemas, del sistema integrado. Nuestro sistema integrado era del año 2004 y nos permitió partir con la norma, se adecuó al nuevo plan de cuentas, nos permitió traspasar saldo, pero claramente no está a la altura de cumplir con las normas NIC-SP en todos los ámbitos. ¿Y qué conlleva eso? Conlleva a que hay que desarrollar sistemas verticales. Las entidades están teniendo que desarrollar sistemas verticales para poder cumplir con las normas. Y eso es otro tema que también es de relevante cuando uno quiere iniciar, si hace el esfuerzo al inicio o durante. Bueno, el otro tema tiene que ver con los estados financieros y las notas explicativas, ¿ya? En ese aspecto, nosotros emitimos estados financieros en forma automática, los estados financieros, pero las notas las tiene que desarrollar cada entidad y eso requiere un esfuerzo. Otro aspecto importante que nosotros pensamos que se necesita una taxonomía para generar estados financieros bajo IPSAS, ¿ya? Y que la podamos adecuar dependiendo de los países que tenemos normas nacionales. Eso es bastante importante en cuanto a avance. Entender que vamos a tener que seguir armonizando las normas. ¿Por qué? Porque en el caso de Chile, por ejemplo, salió una norma de transferencia presupuestaria que nos modificó quién es la entidad que tiene el control para efecto de contabilizar las transferencias. Entonces, las normas hay que entender que van a ser siempre dinámicas y nosotros siempre tenemos bajo el hombro el tema de las leyes y las leyes nos cambian los tratamientos y tenemos que cumplir con la norma contable y también cumplir con la norma legal. Otro aspecto importante es avanzar hacia la interpretación de estados financieros, ya bajo normativa IPSAS. Ahí yo creo que también la experiencia internacional nos ayudaría mucho. Nos tocó en un servicio que nos dijeron, pero ¿cómo? Tengo una pérdida en el estado de resultados, ¿cómo voy a mostrar eso? ¿Ya? Entonces, ¿cómo nosotros ayudamos a interpretar en el sector público cada uno de los estados? Y el otro aspecto relevante es generar expertos en materias. de concesiones, de infraestructura pública, de bienes del patrimonio histórico. Eso para nosotros es relevante poder contar, porque va a llegar un momento en que nosotros como país, imagínense el caso de Chile, estamos tan alejados, somos tan pequeños, contar entre nosotros la experiencia no nos ayuda mucho, ¿ya? Entonces la experiencia internacional en este aspecto es muy relevante. Bueno, y para finalizar, nuestro reto más importante, que ahí me lo había saltado, tiene que ver con el sector municipal. Todo lo que yo le hablé corresponde a lo que es el proceso NIC-CP para lo que es gobierno central, que en el caso de Chile son las entidades que están en la ley de presupuesto, servicios centralizados, descentralizados e instituciones autónomas, pero el mismo proceso ahora va hacia lo que es el sector municipal y eso tiene su mayor complejidad. Esto otro se lo voy a dejar de regalo, que son las oportunidades de las NIC-CP, ya en la presentación, que yo creo que si no las hacemos vamos a quedar al debe con la reforma, ya, y muchas gracias, y gracias por la invitación.
Muchas gracias, Yolanda. Muy rápidamente, porque ya estamos 5 minutos tarde. Voy a resumir en unos minutos los principales temas que se comentaron en esta mesa y a continuación abrimos el piso para un par de preguntas. El principal objetivo de esta sesión fue presentar por qué la contabilidad gubernamental no es un patito fuerte, una lengua muerte o un mal necesario. Y eso es debido porque su principal objetivo es generar la información financiera confiable, oportuna, comparable, pero sobre todo útil para la toma de decisiones. Jan estaba mencionando y otros colegas de las principales tendencias a nivel mundial en materia de buenas prácticas en la contabilidad del sector público. Y dichas tendencias se pueden resumir de la siguiente manera. En algunos países el principal reto en este momento es transitar de la base de contabilidad caja hacia la base de contabilidad de vengado. En países, digamos, más básicos en términos de la reforma de la contabilidad del sector público. Algunos otros países están transitando o tratando de implementar normas nacionales basadas en las normas internacionales de contabilidad del sector público. Grupo de algunos otros países han logrado implementar normas nacionales basadas en las normas internacionales de información financiera o las IFRS generalmente aplicadas por el sector privado. Algunos otros grupos de países están utilizando normas nacionales que no están necesariamente basadas en las buenas prácticas internacionales como las NIC-CP o las NIFs. Un pequeño porción de países y además el sistema de Naciones Unidas han logrado implementar las NIC-CP tal cual. Y finalmente, en caso de México, tenemos una tendencia muy interesante que es la armonización contable nacional como primer paso y un segundo paso, convergencia con las buenas prácticas internacionales. Algunos elementos críticos que se tienen que tomar en cuenta en el proceso de las reformas de contabilidad del sector público que se mencionaron en esta mesa son voluntad política, capacidad institucional, marco normativo existente, gestión de proyecto, incluyendo la gestión de cambio, lo que incluye también los aspectos de capacitación, la existencia de sistemas integrados de gestión financiera, existencia de recursos necesarios, tanto financieros como humanos como materiales, y finalmente, desde la parte, digamos, técnica de implementación de algunos aspectos específicos, el tema de administración de activos fijos que mencionaron, yo creo que prácticamente todos los ponentes el día de hoy, es un tema esencial, sobre todo en contexto del sector público, incluyendo los aspectos de su identificación, porque en muchos casos, al menos en países de la región de América Latina, los activos financieros ni siquiera están identificados administrativamente, seguido por su evaluación, reconocimiento contable, presentación de estados financieros y finalmente revelación de cualquier información adicional en las notas de estados financieros. A continuación quisiera abrir el piso para 2 o 3 preguntas o hasta donde nos da el tiempo. Sé que ya ha habido varias preguntas en el auditorio. César, sé que tú fuiste uno de los primeros.
Gracias. César Duro, Argentina, contador de generación, para la señorita Ivy Edwards, porque al pasar en su explicación mencionó algo muy interesante, porque toda esta información no solamente es para nosotros, es para el ciudadano. Entonces, habló de los periodistas, habló de los legisladores, es decir, en Argentina entendemos que este tema de capacitación tiene que ser a todo nivel de estudio y también tiene que ser transversal a todos los ciudadanos, ¿no? Porque hay mucha opinión, hay mucha gente que opina y realmente sabe poco de este tema. En Estados Unidos, de acuerdo a lo que planteó en la capacitación a los periodistas, legisladores, ¿hay algún plan específico de masificación de este estudio en lo que es cuentas públicas?
¿Es pregunta para alguien en particular o el que...? Perfecto.
Thank you for the question. We've spent, as I mentioned, the user-centered design research that we've conducted is tried to make, if you go to the website that I provided at the last page of my presentation, the beta.usaspending.gov, you'll see that the website's been designed as if perhaps you may not know anything about U.S. spending. So it starts at the top where it says, last year the federal government spent $3.8 trillion of federal spending. And if you want to search something specific, you can do that, or you can scroll down and see the big categories of spending that we have. So like the Social Security, which is a program we have, or how much is to spend on defense or education or transportation, the large categories. And if you're interested in those aspects, you can drill in and see the data related to that. If you want to go for, so we have some very introductory information about how to use the site, how to understand spending. There's also a glossary that we created that scrolls over on the website, and it has the accounting or the technical terms, but in addition it has plain language, so that if you're just an average citizen and you understand what obligations mean or any other of the technical terms, you can actually see that. So we did have, it is a difficult thing to balance, the accurate and, clear display of information in a way that meets standards, but also is clear and anyone could be able to find that information. So we've tried. I think there's much more that we need to do, and something we're thinking about, how to make sure that we make this information available to everyone, because it is part of our duty as stewards of taxpayer dollars to make sure that people understand where they go. And so we're committed to that. We've made an attempt through all the research and other things that we've done, but there's probably more that we can do to help make that more clear. And our website's still open for feedback, so hopefully we'll get some more of that. Thank you.
Boa tarde. Eu vou fazer a pergunta em português para a Sama, sobre PPP. Meu nome é Henrique, sou do Tribunal de Contas do Brasil, e no Brasil a gente ainda não implementou a IPSA 32. O modelo de contabilização no Brasil hoje é com base no risco e não no controle da PPP. Ok?
¿Tenemos traducción al portugués? ¿Del portugués al inglés? ¿Qué canales? Could you repeat? ¿Podrías repetir, por favor?
Português or in English? Português?
English? Could you do it in English?
I can try.
Português está bem.
Português? Ok. Vou repetir. Sou Henrique, do Tribunal de Contas do Brasil. No Brasil, nós não implementamos ainda a IPSA 32. Nós utilizamos a contabilização da PPP com base no risco e não no controle, como diz a IPSA. O problema é que, com base no risco, a gente não consegue mensurar se de fato o risco vai representar a realidade. E acaba que grande parte dos ativos não são contabilizados. Por outro lado, o modelo da IPSA, ao trazer a contabilização com base no controle, é difícil para a gente, porque os ativos não... embora nós tenhamos, o setor público tenha o controle do contrato, geralmente nós não temos o controle do ativo. Geralmente o ativo fica em controle do setor privado. Então, como lidar com essa questão? Já que o modelo de contabilização com base no risco não é o mais adequado e que a IPSA traz o modelo de registro com base no controle, como lidar com essa dificuldade de dizer se o ativo é ou não do setor público?
Thank you. Sorry about that. I didn't hear it in English first. So you ask a very good question. For a long time, there are still different standards out there. So there's not complete international agreement in the community about which approach to follow. As you know, the statistical GFSM manual, as you mentioned, followed the risk and reward approach, which means you have to assess who bears the majority of the risks and who reaps the majority of the rewards. And IPSAS followed the control approach. And Eurostat even followed a completely different approach where the majority of PPPs would not go on the balance sheet because if the private just bears construction risks and either demand or availability, then it goes completely on the private balance sheet. So the GFSM risk and rewards is still not very firm on how to implement. How do you assess, for example, what is bearing the majority of the risks and reaping the majority of the rewards, as you mentioned? But I think that the IPSAS gives a clearer approach in this regard, because the control approach simply, you have to answer two issues. One is whether the public controls what are the services provided and what are the prices provided and to whom they are provided, and whether they have residual entitlement or ownership at the end of the contract. So if you answer yes to these two questions, it's pretty straightforward to say that you would put it on the public balance sheet and not on the private balance sheet. So for example, I mean, in a road example where it's done by user fees and you regulate the tariffs in the contract, and that the road transfers to the public at the end of the contract, you would just determine that this would be on the public balance sheet. I hope this answers the question. Yeah, of course.
Jan, please.
Yeah, I mean, that was a very good explanation. Just to add two things, I think. Firstly, IPSASB looks at whether to go for risks and rewards or control, and exactly for the reasons that you've identified, went for control. And the second point about control is that IPSAS 32 is the mirror image of IFRIC 12 in terms of the private sector accounting. So, you know, A, the control approach is clearer, but B, it also is the mirror image of the approach that the private sector should be looking at. So that was one of the things that was also important and I think should help.
Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Los felicito a todos. Si me permite, Ms. Sama, una pregunta sobre su herramienta. Esta herramienta supone que tenemos información completa y clara. Y ese no es el mundo real al hacer contabilidad. Nunca tenemos información en detalle. Entonces quisiera preguntar si esa herramienta nos permite hacer estimaciones, aproximaciones. Y la segunda pregunta sobre la misma herramienta es, usted mostró una tabla de riesgos en la herramienta, pero no vi el riesgo de corrupción, y seguramente que usted sabe que es el principal problema que tenemos asociado a estos temas de APPs. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for these two questions. So on your first point for the tool, I think the requirements from the user are very basic. For example, construction cost. This should be present in every PPP contract. The duration of construction, when we piloted this tool in many countries, and one of them I did is Georgia. So we didn't know how long it would take to construct a hydropower dam. So in this case, you can assume 3 or 4 years, or you can talk, it's not written in the contract necessarily, but you can assume 3 or 4 years. One other aspect is depreciation of the asset. This is also important because it matters for how you account for it over time. And here also, if the user doesn't enter information, we make some assumptions that it's just linear depreciation over time. So there are many cases where we make assumptions and you don't have to put everything firm. On the risk assessment, you raise a very good point. The very first risk that was part of the 11 risk was governance risk. So this is the risk that, PPPs are part of a public investment management framework overall. And in the IMF, we also look at public investment management assessment. And part of it is your project selection and appraisal. And the governance risk is the risk that you don't have a formal system in place that properly selects and appraises these projects to determine whether, first of all, you even need them at all from a cost-benefit analysis point of view, or whether the PPP route is the better route than traditional procurement. Is it really bringing in efficiency or savings? So we usually recommend that there are formal techniques in place, and the governance risk is the absence of these, and corruption could be part of that. That could lead to higher fiscal risks of basically selecting projects for political reasons and not because there's a formal procedure in place.
Muchas gracias. Yo creo que con eso concluimos esa parte oficial de la sesión. Estoy seguro que todos los exponentes estarán felices de aclarar cualquier duda que ustedes pudieran tener durante el coffee break o a lo largo de esta tarde y el día de mañana. A continuación procedemos con la entrega de los certificados y los pequeños regalos en nombre de los organizadores de este evento. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you. Amy, thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Eso es para mí. Muchas gracias. Would you mind to take a picture for the record? What do you prefer, do it on the podium or maybe, yeah, let's try to do it somehow. Over here. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Thank you.